began in the United States. Here in Brattleboro, the federal government constructed a military base for Union troops to gather and prepare for war. This is the story of the first group of soldiers to assemble in Brattleboro and muster into the military. This is the story of Vermont's 4th Regiment. We begin 40 years before the war started.
In 1820, slavery in America was causing moral and practical conflict between states and individuals. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and a slave owner, summed up the dilemma. He wrote that slavery was like grabbing a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. On one hand, the export value of cotton was higher than all other U.S. exports combined. On the other, the moral scar of slavery on the U.S. soul was immeasurable. The idea of compromise between those for and against slavery diminished every day.
The Vermont Phoenix newspaper, published weekly in Brattleboro, summed up the slavery issue this way: "Shall the country continue one half free and one half slave, or shall property and man have a constitutional protection in the interest of lust and gold?" 11 states voted to leave the Union and form the Confederate States of America. 21 states remained loyal to the U.S. and began organizing troops to confront the rebels. 5 states were on the border and had elements that supported both sides. Many issues came together to start the Civil War. States' rights, the preserving of the Union, the economy, and the role of the federal government were all tied in the practice of slavery in the United States. Not all soldiers fought to end or preserve slavery, but slavery was the cause of what they did fight for: a way of life, loyalty to a government, economic and political power. The institution of slavery supported all of these issues.
On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery batteries opened fire on U.S. Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This began a military rebellion against the Union by southern states. On April 15th, President Abraham Lincoln issued a call for the establishment of a 75,000-man army to suppress the rebellion.
The 1st Vermont Regiment of Soldiers was organized in Rutland and was commanded by Brattleboro man John Phelps. Phelps had graduated from West Point in 1836 and had been in the military most of his life. The 1st Regiment was made of 3-month volunteers. The belief at the time was the rebellion would not be very strong, and the war would be over by the fall of 1861. The 2nd Regiment was formed in Burlington and consisted of militias from around the state. It formed almost 2 months after the 1st Regiment, and by that time, people realized the war would last for more than 3 months. Soldiers in the 2nd Regiment were 3-year volunteers. Militiamen and volunteer firemen from Brattleboro joined this regiment. The 3rd Regiment was made up of soldiers from northeast Vermont, and they were also 3-year volunteers.
The Battle of Bull Run was the first major battle of the Civil War. It took place on July 21, 1861, and it was a Union defeat. It made the people in the North realize that war was not going to be easy. Private Orlando Turner from Vermont's 2nd Regiment was 22 years old. This is from a letter he sent to his parents after the Battle of Bull Run.
Dear Father and Mother, I was not killed in the fight at Bull's Run. We marched 15 miles to fight, and we was tired, you better believe. As quick as we went right into the fight without stopping to rest, we fought 50 minutes where the cannon racked us and the infantry racked us volley after volley, and our regiment stood and did not flinch 1 inch. We fired 7 rounds after we was ordered off the field. It was a hard fight, you better believe. The enemy was in the woods and they could see us, but we could not see them. Our cannon shot all of their ammunition out, and the enemy could see we could do nothing. We had to retreat to Alexandria. Our march to the battle until Alexandria was made in 36 hours, 60 miles. We was all tired, you better believe. The shells burst over our heads. The men was as cool as if they was shooting at a mark. There was not one that flinched 1 inch. Our generals and colonels was afraid to go where the men would. The boys think that they did not have fair play, for they would not let us go to the charge. You better believe that the cannonballs whistled all around us. There are 6 holes in the flag. There was 2 of our color guard killed and 1 wounded. Our regiment lost 12 or 15 killed and 30 wounded and prisoners. Our regiment got a good name for fighting so well. We was the last regiment in the fight.
On July 30th, 1861, Vermont Governor Erastus Fairbanks issued a call for the immediate enlisting of 2 regiments of volunteers to each serve for 3 years. These would become the 4th and 5th Regiments of Vermont. The disastrous Battle of Bull Run had shown the Union that the rebellion would not be ending quickly. The Union defeat at Bull Run in Virginia made it clear that more troops would be needed.
Marshal Twitchell from Townsend volunteered and was assigned to the 4th Vermont Regiment. This regiment would form in Brattleboro at the military camp just south of the village.
The Battle of Bull Run gave me my first impression that Southern people entertained a higher regard for their institutions than they did for their Union. I decided to enlist immediately.
The institution of slavery had brought the country to a bloody war.
Soldiers from the 1st Regiment, the 3-month regiment, had just returned to Brattleboro from their tour protecting Washington, D.C., and they mustered out of the military on August 16, 1861. Troops were paid $13 a month from the national government and $7 a month from Vermont. 1,006 men enlisted in the 4th Regiment. Most were from southern Vermont. About 70% were farmers. They were born in Vermont and they were under 25 years old. When the 3-year enlistment was completed, about 2/3 of these soldiers would no longer be with the regiment. When Marshal Twitchell reported to the camp in Brattleboro, his first meal was a piece of bread, a slice of meat, and coffee in a tin cup. He served the military for 5 years and said the food never got better than that first meal. Estelle Johnson and her sister-in-law, Lydia Wood, volunteered for military service in August 1861.
Recruiters had talked their husbands into volunteering, so they volunteered as well.
The 2 women joined the 4th Regiment as hospital matrons.
They mustered in with the rest of the troops in Brattleboro and traveled by train to Washington, D.C.
The 2 women quickly began caring for soldiers suffering from typhoid fever and the measles.
Estelle's husband came down with typhoid fever and slowly recovered. Lydia also caught the fever and died. Her body was returned to Vermont for burial.
Estelle's husband next contracted arthritis in his knee and was discharged as he could no longer march long distances. Estelle and her husband returned to Vermont in April 1862.
Many Vermont women served as nurses and matrons with the regiments in the field and at the 3 Vermont military hospitals in Brattleboro, Burlington, and Montpelier.
This is a photograph of part of the 4th Regiment. They were sworn into service for a term of 3 years at Brattleboro on September 21, 1861. They were the first Vermont volunteers to be issued what became the standard blue uniform. They were also the first group of soldiers to depart the Brattleboro military camp, march to the railroad station, and head to war.
Frederick Holbrook from Brattleboro became the next governor when Erastus Fairbanks left office. He said that almost 40% of the 35,000 Vermont men who joined the Union effort during the Civil War were placed into regiments and trained at the Brattleboro camp before they went to defend the Union. As the war progressed, a U.S. military hospital was also built at the camp. During the course of the war, over 4,500 Union soldiers were cared for at the hospital.
For Marshal Twitchell's first night in Brattleboro with the 4th Regiment, he slept on straw with a single blanket in a tent with 19 other men. He wrote that he felt he was being treated no better than a pig back on this farm. On September 21st, the 4th Regiment left Brattleboro by train, traveled to New Haven, Connecticut, took a steamboat to Jersey City, New Jersey, then a train to Philadelphia and had dinner. 24 hours later, their train pulled into Washington, D.C. As he prepared to bed down for the first night in Washington, D.C., Twitchell asked for some straw to lay on. He was told that the Union horses were valued more than he was, and they would get the straw before he did.
Twitchell continued to struggle with his adjustments to Army life. The first Army meal in Washington, D.C. was rejected as not fit to eat by the 4th Regiment commander, and Twitchell went to bed hungry and uncomfortable. Private Ting Kiley, also of the 4th Regiment, wrote in his diary about what George Washington might think of the Civil War.
Methinks as George Washington walks the golden streets of paradise, his proud spirit weeps as he sees the happy country which he fought for now, standing in deadly array against each other and deluging the continent with blood and misery.
The 4th Regiment joined other Vermont regiments to form the Vermont Brigade at Camp Advance. Camp Advance was located about 8 miles outside of Washington, D.C., in McLean, Virginia. The Vermont Brigade protected Washington from Confederate attacks for about 5 months and spent its first winter at Camp Advance.
The first commander of the 4th Regiment was Colonel Edwin Stoughton. He was from Bellows Falls and was a graduate of West Point. He was 23 years old when he was given command of the 4th Regiment and was the youngest colonel in the Union Army at the time.
Camp Advance was the first established in densely wooded, swampy area, and many of the soldiers became sick. The camp was moved to higher ground, and the health of the troops improved. Troops suffered from measles, chicken pox, mumps, whooping cough, diarrhea, dysentery, malaria, typhoid fever, and pneumonia. Most soldiers in the 4th Regiment died from disease than from battle.
This is a map that shows where the 4th Regiment spent its 4 years fighting during the Civil War. Names like Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg are familiar to many. The 4th Regiment was also heavily impacted by Lee's Mill, the Wilderness, Weldon Railroad, and Petersburg. While these battles may not be as well known, they certainly were important to the survival of the Union and the survival of the 4th Regiment.
This is part of a letter sent home by Sergeant Ransom Towle explaining how the troops were still bouncing back from illness during that first winter.
We have 7 in our tent, 4 of whom are sick and likely to be at present.
You can see that the troops had begun to modify their tents by building a first level of logs and then attaching the tent as a roof. They even had little metal wood stoves that could be used inside the buildings during the winter months. Sergeant Towle would not survive the war. He was wounded twice, taken prisoner once, escaped to return to the 4th Regiment, and was killed in a battle less than 3 years after he wrote this letter home.
On March 10, 1862, the 4th Regiment left the defense of Washington and marched to the Virginia Peninsula to engage the Confederates. On April 16, 1862, the 1st Vermont Brigade, which included the 4th Regiment, attempted to cross a dam made by the Confederates to slow the advance of Union troops. The Confederates had worked to create a killing field by damming a small river, building 2 earthen berms, and clearing the land of trees. Twice Colonel Stoughton led his men in an attempt to cross the dam and defeat the rebels. Both attacks failed. However, Colonel Stoughton became a hero to his men as he personally dragged wounded soldiers to safety.
The 4th's first engagement with the enemy was costly. The Peninsula Campaign continued through the summer, months without much success.
Savage's Station was part of a 7-day battle that took place in the Virginia countryside. Union General McClellan had begun an attack against Confederate General Lee's army. Quickly, Lee gained the upper hand, and McClellan was forced to retreat. During the retreat, the Vermont Brigade had charged after the retreating rebels into the woods and were met with murderous fire, suffering more casualties than any brigade on the field that day. The brigade as a whole took 439 casualties. The 5th Vermont Regiment lost nearly half its men, 209 of 428. The 4th Regiment lost 8 men who were abandoned at the field hospital. The battle was a stalemate at the cost of about 1,500 casualties on both sides, plus 2,500 previously wounded Union soldiers who were left to be captured when their field hospital was forsaken.
Sergeant Silas Stone of the 4th Regiment was one of the 2,500 wounded soldiers abandoned at Savage Station during the Union retreat. He was taken as a prisoner of war and was killed on July 25, 1862. Once released, he still needed to recover from his injuries. He was transferred to the military hospital in Brattleboro. On December 15, 1863, he re-enlisted, rejoined his regiment, and completed his service to his country. The U.S. Military Hospital in Brattleboro treated over 4,500 soldiers during the war. Less than 100 soldiers died while being treated at the hospital in Brattleboro.
The U.S. Sanitary Commission was a national organization that was a combination of today's Red Cross and the USO. It consisted mostly of women volunteers who wanted to make contributions to the war effort. The volunteers raised money, collected donations, worked as nurses, ran kitchens in the Army's camps, worked at hospitals, provided homes for traveling or disabled soldiers, made uniforms, and organized fundraisers to supply soldiers.
Confederate Commander General Robert E. Lee spent much of his time attempting to cut railroad supply lines between Washington, D.C. and the northern states. Union General McClellan ordered the 4th Regiment to march north towards Antietam, Maryland, to stop Lee from gaining an advantage in the north.
On the way to Antietam, the 4th Regiment came upon rebels at Crampton's Gap in Maryland. A quick battle resulted in the 4th Regiment's capturing 120 Confederates and the colors of the 16th Virginia Confederate Regiment. Regiments were told never to give up their colors to the enemy, as it meant complete defeat. Lieutenant George Hooker of the 4th Regiment was awarded the Medal of Honor for being instrumental in this victory. The day after Crampton's Gap, the march towards Antietam continued. Marshal Twitchell wrote,
The following day we listened to the guns of the first day's battle at Antietam. The next we moved for the battlefield, wading Antietam Creek in order to make the last fight for possession of the bloody cornfield. At once everything was obscured by smoke. For a few moments the roll of musketry and the thunder of artillery with the yells of the combatants were commingled, and we saw the broken Confederate column returning to its own lines.
At the three-day Battle of Antietam, the Union troops outnumbered the rebels 2-1, but the battle ended in a stalemate with neither side gaining an advantage. This photograph shows President Lincoln meeting with General McClellan at Antietam. Lincoln wanted the Union generals to be more aggressive. Meanwhile, the 4th Regiment had spent most of the summer attacking and retreating on the Virginia Peninsula. Twitchell had been promoted to sergeant during the summer campaign.
Our summer's work had been made up largely of battles, skirmishes, and forced marches, and had left us almost without blankets, tents, shoes, or change of clothing. At Hagerstown, Maryland, we could purchase underclothing, blankets, and shoes.
The 4th Regiment camped at Hagerstown, Maryland for 33 days and received 109 recruits to fill in for those captured, killed, wounded, or too sick to fight. This break in the action frustrated President Lincoln, who thought General McClellan should be pursuing the Confederate Army more aggressively. Many of the soldiers who served under McClellan appreciated the break. In 2 years' time, McClellan would run against Lincoln for president and receive more votes from the 4th Regiment soldiers than Lincoln. On November 5, 1862, Colonel Edwin Stoughton was promoted to general and was assigned to command the 2nd Vermont Brigade. His brother, Charles Stoughton, was promoted to colonel and commander of the 4th Vermont Regiment.
Lincoln was frustrated with McClellan and replaced him with General Burnside in hopes of finding a more aggressive leader for the Union Army. General Burnside decided to attack the heights of Fredericksburg, Virginia. This was a Confederate stronghold. On December 13th, the 4th Regiment was sent out on the skirmish line which meant they led the main body of troops and looked to engage the enemy. The regiment suffered severely. 46 of the 4th Regiment were killed or wounded during the assault. They were forced to retreat. The Union suffered casualties twice as heavy as those suffered by the Confederates. On December 15th, General Burnside withdrew his troops. Sergeant Twitchell wrote of the assault.
While on the skirmish line, a bullet passed over my left shoulder, cutting 13 holes through my rubber blanket, which I was carrying. I felt well satisfied that I was no taller.
Twitchell was 5 feet 7 inches tall.
After the Battle of Fredericksburg, Charles Stoughton, the new colonel and commander of the 4th Regiment, reported,
My colors were completely riddled with canister and musket balls. They were scarcely hanging together. The top of the staff, upon which is a brass eagle, was shot away by canister, but saved and brought away.
In January 1863, General Burnside decided to attack Fredericksburg again. The 4th Regiment moved out, but it immediately began to rain, and the troops attempted to move wagons and artillery pieces through knee-deep mud. Burnside stopped the attempt after 2 days. President Lincoln replaced Burnside with General Hooker within a few days of the disastrous Mud March. Sergeant Twitchell wrote this about the Mud March.
The Mud March doubtless put as many men in the hospital as a severe battle, while the destruction of the mules must have exceeded that of a hard campaign.
In the spring of 1863, Confederate General Lee split his army between a few cities in Virginia. Union General Hooker decided to split the Union force and attack the Confederates at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. The 4th Vermont Regiment was involved in the 3rd attempt at taking Fredericksburg. This time they were successful. After defeating the force at Fredericksburg, the 4th Regiment began to move towards Chancellorsville. The Confederates were able to slow and stop the advance of the 4th Regiment. Meanwhile, Lee's army was able to outmaneuver the Union troops at Chancellorsville, and General Hooker withdrew from his attack.
The 4th looked to join the rest of the Union Army at Chancellorsville and engaged in skirmishes with rebels while the two armies were struggling to get organized between Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. On May 4th, at Banksford, Virginia, Sergeant Robert Coffee single-handedly captured 2 Confederate officers and 5 privates. He came upon the 7 men, ordered them to surrender, threw their rifles into a stream, and then they realized he was by himself. After the war, Coffee was given the Medal of Honor.
After the indecisive Battle of Chancellorsville, the 4th joined up with the main body of General Hooker's Union Potomac Army, and the troops stayed in camp for the next month, waiting for orders concerning the next battle. Again, this frustrated Lincoln, as he saw summer as the best time to fight, yet his generals didn't seem to have a plan. Meanwhile, Lee's Confederate army decided to invade Union North.
Lee headed north into Pennsylvania. General Hooker ordered Union troops to march as quickly as possible to cut off the rebels from their bold attack into Union territory.
Put the Vermonters ahead and keep the Corps well closed up.
The 4th Regiment began marching north on June 13th. They continued marching until June 30th, when they stopped about 30 miles from Gettysburg. According to Sergeant Twitchell, on July 1st,
just before the bugle sounded, our rest was broken, and the Vermont Brigade was placed in front on the road to Gettysburg. I do not remember any long halts until we reached the field of Gettysburg about 2 p.m. on July 2.
The 4th Regiment marched 30 miles overnight and into the afternoon of the next day in order to participate in part of the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, the 4th was placed on the far left of the Union line. For most of the battle, they watched the fight taking place to their right. The 2nd Vermont Brigade helped defeat the rebels at Pickett's Charge. The Union troops poured through the rebel lines and began chasing the retreating Confederate soldiers. The next few days kept the 4th busy as they engaged the enemy while the rebels attempted to return south.
On July 10, 1863, the 4th Regiment engaged the retreating rebels in Funkstown, Maryland. The regiment had 3 men killed in this battle and 23 wounded. One of the wounded was Colonel Charles Stoughton. He was shot on the right side of his face and lost his right eye. Colonel Stoughton recovered from the injury, but left the Army 6 months later. For 10 days following the Battle of Funkstown, the 4th continued to pursue Lee's army into Virginia. The 4th then halted near Warrenton, Virginia, until August 10th.
The war was lasting much longer than most had predicted. It was no longer easy to find volunteers to join the Union Army. The United States began a draft for the first time in its history. Men who were 18 and had registered to vote were eligible. Part of the draft law allowed for men to pay a $300 fee to avoid the draft. Men could also pay others to substitute for them. In the 1860s, $300 was a good yearly salary. Many working men in New York City did not want to be drafted. Different estimates suggest between 200 and 2,000 people died in the New York City draft riots. In late July, working-class men did not want to get drafted, while others could pay $300 to avoid the war. There were racial and immigrant overtones during the riots, and most who died were black or recently arrived immigrants. The 4th Regiment received orders to march to the nearest railroad station on August 10th so they could travel to New York City to enforce the draft.
In a few days, the draft was completed, and we were on our way back to our old position in the Army of the Potomac.
The 4th Regiment has been operating with only half its original soldiers from most of 1863. Illnesses, casualties, and captured soldiers has left the 4th Regiment with 450 able-bodied men. In September of 1863, the 4th Vermont Regiment was reinforced with 200 volunteers and draftees. They had been at war for 2 years.
Lieutenant Albert Crane wrote to the Rutland Herald about the reinforcements.
The first detachment of new recruits for this brigade arrived. They are generally fine-looking men and much larger than the average of those now here. An unusually large proportion are French, but none are the worse for that. The French and the Irish make good soldiers, but save us from the Dutchmen. The young soldier fears only the dangers of the battlefield, but disease is his greatest enemy.
The original men of the 4th were due to leave the Army in September of 1864, as their 3-year enlistment would be over. The Army offered incentives for the soldiers to re-enlist. Veteran soldiers who re-enlisted received a $400 bounty and 30 to 35-day furloughs. 210 men from the original 4th re-enlisted. Many veteran troops from the 4th Regiment returned home for part of the winter on leave. About 130 of the original troops chose not to re-enlist and waited until September of the upcoming year to muster out and return home.
As calm was restored to New York City, the 4th Regiment reported back to an Army of the Potomac camped in Northern Virginia. After the Battle of Gettysburg, both armies, Confederate and Union, had drifted south into Northern Virginia and spared with one another. Abraham Lincoln had replaced General Hooker with General Meade. Meade was a bit more aggressive than Hooker. However, Lincoln still wanted more. Meade planned an attack on Lee's army for late in November. The 4th Regiment marched and prepared for battle over 5 days in late November, early December. The Union General Meade decided to retreat without fighting. Lincoln became frustrated with Meade's decision not to fight and replaced him with General Ulysses S. Grant.
On May 1, 1864, at the opening of the spring campaign, over 700 troops in the 4th Regiment were present for duty. On May 4th, the 4th Regiment joined the remainder of the Vermont Brigade and marched west into northern Virginia, in an area known as the Wilderness. Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to attack the Union troops while they were in the Wilderness, as the thick vegetation would limit the Union's ability to use superior cavalry and artillery. The 4th Regiment was now led by Colonel George Perkins Foster. He had been in the 4th Regiment from the beginning, had worked his way through the ranks, and had earned the respect of his men. They called him the Fighting Colonel because he did not back down from a fight and showed strong problem-solving skills while in battle.
The next few campaigns brought the 4th Regiment to its knees. The Monters did not back down, but they were decimated. Grant and Lee knew it was a battle of numbers. There were more Union troops than the Confederate, so Lee took to gain advantage by attacking the Union when they could not use their numerical superiority. During the Battle of the Wilderness, the Vermont Brigade consisted of less than 3,000 men. They held the position against the assault of 14,000 rebels. For the 4th Regiment, this would be the most costly battle of the war. 40% of the 4th Regiment was killed or wounded in the Battle of the Wilderness.
The Battle of the Wilderness was devastating. Private Luther Harris of the 4th Regiment wrote about the first night of the battle.
It was the saddest night the Vermonters had ever known.
Sergeant Marshall Twitchell wrote that the battle line extended for 28 miles.
My company of 53 men, 1 hour before, was left commanded by the only sergeant standing, and had but 21 uninjured.
After the war, Sergeant Marshall Twitchell wrote about his experience at the Wilderness.
An hour's fighting, and we had gained 20 rods. We were gradually pushed back until we had lost nearly 4 rods. The men, dropping on their knees, the better to shoot around the trees, delivered such a terrific and continuous fire that the enemy halted. Captain Lilly sprang in front of the line and gave the order, "Forward." The line moved, the captain fell, and the line halted. Lieutenant Carr immediately took his place and gave the same order with the same result. As he fell, he turned towards me and said, "You are now in command." I gave the order, "Forward, till you cover the wounded, and then lie down." That kneeling line swept over the 4 rods and threw itself in line, rifle in hand, in front of the farthest wounded man. For a moment I stood proudly. Then I, like my seniors before me, fell.
Twitchell had been shot in the head. He was carried to the rear. The next day he came to consciousness and found himself in the tent reserved for the dead. When found alive, he was moved to a tent for the severely wounded, where he went unconscious again for another day. When he came to, he was told that all men thought able to survive had been transferred by wagon to Fredericksburg. He was staying. He wasn't expected to make it.
Next day, men from the 1st Vermont Cavalry found Twitchell staggering alone in the woods, through the woods. They got him to a field hospital and eventually made it home to Vermont, where he recovered from his wounds for 100 days. When he returned to action, he had transferred as a sergeant to command in the 109th Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops in Kentucky. He was promoted to captain and stayed in the Army through the war. He remained in the cell stationed in Texas and Louisiana. He eventually married a woman from Louisiana and remained in the cell for the rest of his life.
Addison Brown Jr. and Denny Farr were brothers-in-law from Brattleboro who served in the 4th Regiment of Vermont. Denny Farr was originally from Chesterfield, New Hampshire. He was a Universalist and often came to Brattleboro to hear the popular sermons of Reverend Addison Brown. Eventually, he moved to Brattleboro to court the Reverend's daughter, Mary.
Farr joined the 4th Regiment on September 7, 1861, with his future brother-in-law, Addison Brown Jr. Together, they went off to fight in the war.
While on leave, Denny and Mary were wed on July 31, 1863. Less than a year later, on May 5, 1864, Captain Denny Farr was one of the first Union soldiers killed at the Wilderness in North Virginia. As the shooting commenced, he rose and led his men and was struck in the head with a bale.
His brother-in-law, Addison Brown Jr., was one of the only officers to survive the Wilderness and continued to fight until illness struck him down after the battles in the Shenandoah Valley in the fall of 1864. On March 3, 1865, Addison Brown Jr. died from his illness in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
In the spring of 1865, the widows of these 2 soldiers traveled south to recover the bodies of their dead husbands.
The 4th Regiment lost over 40% of its forces during this 3-day battle. Private Luther Harris wrote,
"It was expected that we should retreat that first night. They were disappointed at finding us there in the morning."
As the battle continued on that second day, the Confederates set the woods on fire to attempt to drive the Vermonters from battle. Harris wrote,
The woods took fire and many wounded ones were killed that would have lived but for the fire. Colonel Lewis Grant from Winhall, Vermont, commanded the Vermont Brigade at the Battle of the Wilderness. The 4th Regiment was part of the Vermont Brigade. According to Colonel Grant, there were 32 Union brigades involved in that 3-day Battle of the Wilderness. The Vermont Brigade was one of the 32 brigades. This one brigade sustained 1/10 of the killed and wounded Union soldiers. During the second day of battle, the Vermont Brigade held their ground while brigades on their left and right retreated. The Vermonters' close ranks, surviving regiments joined together and continued the battle. They held their ground.
They were a noble band of veterans determined to stand as long as there was a man to bear their flag aloft or an enemy in the field.
The Battle of the Wilderness was devastating to the 4th, but was militarily a tactical draw between the two sides. General Ulysses Grant did not retreat and lick his wounds like generals before him had done. Instead, he was intent upon chasing the rebels down and attacking them at every opportunity. On the evening of May 7th, the 4th Regiment was given the task of protecting the train lines from rebel advances while Union troops were transported away from the wilderness. This continued for 2 more days. Several more men were lost as the rebels attempted to destroy the lines. On May 12th, the 4th fought in the front line at Spotsylvania, and it loses for that week-long battle were 48 men killed or wounded. 32,000 troops from both sides were killed or wounded in and around Spotsylvania in almost a month of fighting.
The Battle of Cold Harbor began on June 1, 1864. The Vermont Brigade, including the 4th Regiment, was placed in the front and middle of the advance against the rebels. The 4th held the line and lost 8 more men. As the battle continued the next day, the line of engagement between the two armies became 7 miles long. Eventually, another 16,000 men from both sides were killed or wounded, as neither Grant or Lee would back down. Grant had more troops and was attempting to outmaneuver Lee and either wipe out Lee's army or capture the rebel capital in Richmond, Virginia.
And ordered the 4th Regiment to Petersburg, Virginia. On June 16th, the 4th arrived outside of the city. Petersburg was a supply line to the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. It was believed that if Petersburg could be captured, then Richmond would fall. The 4th was ordered to attack a Confederate railroad line that led to Petersburg. The line was in a small town called Weldon. The 4th went into battle with little support, and it was quickly overwhelmed by the enemy. 144 soldiers of the 4th were captured.
From the battle at Weldon Railroad, many of the soldiers captured were transported to Andersonville Prison in Georgia. About 13,000 of the 45,000 Union troops who spent time at the Andersonville prison died of starvation, malnutrition, illness, or disease. 65 of the 144 captured men from the battle at Weldon Railroad eventually died in Confederate prisons.
After the capture at Weldon Railroad and the decimation at the Wilderness and the constant battles after the Wilderness, the 4th Regiment was almost wiped out. From a regiment that began the war with over 1,000 soldiers and had received 200 replacements, there were only 70 men left who could fight.
A week later, June 30, 1864, because of reassignments and the return of injured and sick troops, the 4th was able to count 282 men fit to report for duty out of a roster of 716.
In early July, the regiment, as a part of the Vermont Brigade, was sent to Washington, D.C. to head off a rebel attack on the capital by Confederate General Jubal Early.
While heading to Washington, the Confederates attempted to destroy the B&O railway line. This line was the main connection between Washington, D.C. and the northern states. The 4th had been assigned to General Sheridan, and they engaged the enemy throughout the Shenandoah Valley from July of 1864 to December of that year. It was the Union's 40,000 troops versus the Confederates' 32,000. The Union kept Early from destroying the rail line and from attacking Washington. The 4th Regiment had 13 men killed and 38 wounded during these battles in the Shenandoah Valley. Among them were the 2nd Lieutenant Luther B. Scott, left, and Sergeant Ransom Towle, above right. Captain Addison Brown, Jr., lower right, became ill after the battle at Winchester on September 19, 1864, and succumbed to the illness before he became healthy enough to return to Vermont.
On September 20th, 1864, the 3-year enlistment term of the original members of the 4th Regiment expired. 346 of the 1,006 men who began with the 4th had survived with the regiment to this point. Death, illness, capture, transfers, and desertions had taken their toll. 136 of the 4th Regiment headed home to Brattleboro to muster out of their military service to the country. They arrived in Brattleboro on September 29, 1864. This is a photograph of some of the returning troops gathered in front of the Brattleboro House on Main Street. 210 soldiers of the original 4th re-enlisted and remained at war.
The 4th Regiment was a part of the 40,000-man Union Army that was successful against Confederate General Early in the Shenandoah Valley. On December 9, 1864, the 4th Regiment returned to the 70,000-troop Army of the Potomac in their siege of Petersburg. The 4th Regiment had about 750 active soldiers.
On April 2nd, 1865, at 4:40 in the morning, the Vermont Brigade ended the 9-month siege of Petersburg by breaking through the rebel line. By the end of the day, Lee ordered his troops to abandon Petersburg and head west. The next day, Richmond was captured, and within a week, Lee surrendered. General Lewis Grant suffered a head wound during the assault, but survived. The 4th Regiment was led by Captain George Amidon during this attack. 2 soldiers from the 4th were killed, and 10 more were wounded in the assault. Once the Vermonters broke through the line, the remainder of the Union troops poured through and advanced upon Petersburg.
Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse ended the War of Rebellion on April 9, 1865. On June 8th, the 4th Regiment marched into the Grand Review at Washington, D.C. as part of the 6th Corps. They proudly marched past President Lincoln and then headed home. About 450 men of the 4th Regiment were able to march in the parade. 47 were still reported as prisoners, and another 230 were listed as injured or sick. Some mustered out June 19th, and the rest marched to New York City. 300 men took a train to Burlington, Vermont, and arrived July 16th to a cordial celebration. They went to the military camp outside of Burlington and mustered out of the military on July 19, 1865.
As soon as the war was over, historians began to write about it. This is a quote from a historian who was writing about the 4th Vermont Regiment. They were called on for their hardest work. They never knew when they were whipped. They stood together like men and fought every battle to the end. Not one of their colors was ever in a rebel hand. Their appearance was quiet and their speech was often homely, but their hearts were stout and their aim steady.
What follows are brief biographies of some of the men of the 4th. Abel Fisher, Danville, Vermont. He married the day before he left to enlist. There were 2 children. Fisher was injured at the Battle of the Wilderness, but was able to serve throughout the war. After the war, he moved to North Carolina and worked as a lawyer and a lumberman. In 1871, he moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the federal government in the pension office. He worked there until his death at the age of 61. His family remained in Washington.
George Spalding, Cavendish, Vermont. George's father was a strong abolitionist who saw the horrors of slavery while growing up in South Carolina. George enlisted when he was 18 years old. At the Battle of Gettysburg, a shot took off Mr. Spalding's cap. He attributed his escape from death to the fact that he was short. In 1864, he was captured outside of Petersburg and was held prisoner at Andersonville for 6 months. He returned to his regiment and re-enlisted. He married a Cavendish girl during the war and they had 3 children. After the war, he worked as a train engineer, first in Rutland, Vermont, and then for 33 years in Texas.
George Hooker, Salem, New York. Hooker enlisted in the 4th Vermont Regiment as a private. He had been a store clerk and a traveling salesman. He was quickly promoted to sergeant, By the end of the war, he had served well enough to earn a Medal of Honor and served 2 general staffs. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and served as an assistant adjutant general of volunteers. After the war, he worked in Boston. In 1868, he married Minnie Fisk, daughter of James Fisk, a store broker and railroad executive, and in 1876 he was admitted as a junior partner in a banking firm in New York. Hooker served in the Vermont House of Representatives and served as a sergeant of arms for the U.S. Congress. He died in 1903.
George Quimby, Linden, Vermont. Quimby graduated from Dartmouth in 1859. He began teaching school in Barton, Vermont, and also began studies to become a lawyer. He enlisted and was made a first lieutenant in the 4th Regiment. In March of 1862, his captain resigned and Quimby took his place. He led his men in several engagements during the Peninsula Campaign and was promoted to major. On December 13, 1862, Quimby was killed at Fredericksburg. He spent most of the day exposed to artillery fire and sharpshooters. He and his men formed a skirmish line around sundown. Standing, he cautioned his men to keep low to avoid danger, as random shots whizzed around. He was hit with a mini ball in the neck and died instantly.
Martin Whitney, Rochester, Vermont. Martin was a third-generation Vermonter. He joined the 4th Regiment and served as a fifer. Drummers, buglers, and fifers were counted on to give a series of commands both on and off the battlefield. Because its sonic range was so high-pitched, the fife was often the only instrument that could be heard clearly over the roar of thousands of rifles and cannon fire. Martin met a woman in Maryland during the war and married her at the war's end. He was never injured or captured during the war, but had a fence shot out from under him while he was climbing over it. They lived and farmed in Maryland until he was needed back home to take care of his ailing parents. He moved back to Rochester with his wife and his sister. His wife died in 1914. He lived until 1931.
Samuel Allen, Newport, New Hampshire. Allen had graduated from Castleton Medical College in 1842. He married in 1841. He practiced medicine in Hartford, Vermont, and spent most of his life there. On August 15, 1861, he volunteered for service and was commissioned Sergeant of the 4th Regiment. He served as the 4th Sergeant for 1 year and was injured twice. He was then promoted to Sergeant for the 6th Corps. He remained in the capacity until he mustered out after his 3rd year enlistment in 1864. He mustered out in Brattleboro, visited his wife for a short time, and re-enlisted. He was assigned to the 6th Corps as a medical inspector and served until the end of the war. After the war, he returned to Hartford, Vermont. He served in the Vermont legislature and continued as a doctor, serving on numerous boards until his death in 1886.
Henry Cushman, Bennington, Vermont. He was in charge of his family's clothing store when the war began. At the age of 20, he volunteered and became a quartermaster for the 4th Regiment. A quartermaster distributed supplies and provisions for the troops and was not generally in combat. During the Battle of the Wilderness, he joined the fight and continued for many days until the regiment was safe and removed from danger. After the war, Cushman took up manufacturing in Bennington. First it was writing tools, and then he began making furniture. He was married in 1867 and remained in the Bennington area until the end of his life in 1922. He served in the Vermont Senate and had 5 children.
Henry Spofford, Weatherfield, Vermont. Spofford was a railway agent at Danby and North Bennington at the beginning of the war. He enlisted in the 4th Regiment as a private and was quickly appointed commissary sergeant. A commissary sergeant was under the command of the quartermaster. He was captured and held prisoner for 7 months at Richmond. He rejoined his regiment, re-enlisted, and was promoted to 1st lieutenant. He became the quartermaster for the 4th Regiment until the end of the war. He returned to the railroads and managed both passengers and freight while working in Bennington and Rutland until 1908 when he retired. He then moved to the West Coast. He was married twice,